The Galactic Empire's war machine moved without resistance across the stars, subjugating species with its overwhelming technological superiority. Worlds fell in weeks, their defenders crushed beneath energy weapons, automated war mechs, and orbital bombardments. Humanity had not been spared the Empire's scorn. To the Imperials, humans were an oddity, primitive, undisciplined, reliant on outdated weapons. The Imperial High Command labeled them cowards, unwilling to engage in proper warfare, with advanced plasma rifles and shielded exosuits. That belief led them to underestimate Earth's forces when they landed on Dara 5. The transport ship's engines roared as it pierced through the planet's storm-ridden atmosphere, turbulence shaking the reinforced hull. Inside, Captain Jack Reynolds checked the harness across his chest, his sharp blue eyes scanning the dimly lit troop bay. Around him sat his team, battle-hardened, restless, waiting for the inevitable chaos. Sergeant Marcus Mack Holloway leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed over his chest, his scarred hands flexing unconsciously. His background in combat engineering made him invaluable, but it was his sheer adaptability under fire that made him dangerous. Beside him, Lieutenant Eric Vasquez meticulously rechecked his weapon, his dark features set in a mask of calm. A demolitions expert, Vasquez had an instinct for destruction, a mind that saw weaknesses before anyone else. "We're dropping hot," Reynolds called over the comms. "Empire's got the whole damn city fortified. They think we won't push. Let's remind them who we are." The bay filled with the sharp clicks of weapons being checked and safeties being flipped off. Mac grinned, rolling his shoulders. "Let's hope these Imperials enjoy a good fight." The transport's doors hissed open, exposing the battlefield below. Dara 5's primary city, once a bustling hub of trade, had become an Imperial stronghold. Towers of steel and glass loomed over shattered streets, patrols of alien soldiers marching in rigid formations. Automated turrets lined the rooftops, scanning for movement. The Empire had dug in, confident in their position, believing their technological advantage made them untouchable. The Americans dropped fast, landing in the city's outskirts, where bombed-out buildings provided cover. The first skirmish erupted before they even reached solid ground. Plasma bolts seared through the air, lighting up the twilight sky with lethal blue streaks. Reynolds hit the ground running, his rifle barking in controlled bursts. The Imperials fought with discipline, their formations tight, their firepower precise. But they weren't ready for the raw aggression of human combat tactics. Vasquez moved first, setting charges along a collapsed overpass. As Imperial walkers advanced, their metal feet grinding against debris, Vasquez detonated the charges. The ground buckled, and the towering war machines plunged into the wreckage below. Mack and his engineers scrambled forward, planting jury-rigged explosives onto the hulls of fallen mechs, ensuring they stayed down. The Imperials fell back, confused. This wasn't how war was supposed to be fought. They relied on overwhelming force, on shields that deflected energy-based attacks. But bullets, kinetic, fast, unforgiving, tore through weak points in their armor. The Empire had designed its soldiers to withstand plasma, not high-velocity projectiles. Reynolds pushed the advantage. "Move in. Keep them off balance." The Americans advanced through the city, carving a path through the Imperial defenses with a mixture of precise marksmanship and sheer audacity. They moved like predators, weaving through the battlefield, striking from angles the Imperials hadn't accounted for. Snipers took out officers. Grenades turned tight formations into smoking craters. By the time the Empire regrouped, the Americans had already taken key ground. Then the real test came. A deep, guttural hum filled the air, a sound that sent vibrations through the ground. The Imperials were done playing defense. Massive troop carriers descended, dropping reinforcements clad in heavy exo-armor. War mechs stomped forward, their plasma cannons charging. From above, aerial gunships circled like carrion birds, their targeting systems locking onto human positions. Reynolds watched the battlefield shift, calculating. The Empire was adapting, pouring heavier firepower onto their heads, cutting off potential escape routes. The Americans had momentum, but they needed more than aggression to win. They needed an edge. Vasquez crouched beside him, eyes scanning the approaching forces. "We can't keep this up forever. They've got us boxed in." Max smirked, pulling a combat knife from his belt and twirling it between his fingers. "Then we break the damn box." Reynolds nodded. They had come in expecting a fight, but this was turning into something bigger. The Imperials weren't just repelling an incursion. They were trying to make a statement. This battle wasn't about Dara 5. It was about proving that humanity didn't belong on the galactic stage. That wasn't going to happen. Reynolds activated his calm command. "We need heavy ordnance. If we're going to push through, we need to hit them where it hurts." The reply came swift. "You're clear for resupply, but you'll have to hold your position until drop-off." Hold the position against an army that outnumbered them 10-1, with air superiority and mechanized support. Reynolds glanced at his men. None of them hesitated. "All right," he said. "Let's show the Empire what cowards really look like." The battle was far from over. The city burned around them, the air thick with smoke and the acrid scent of scorched metal. Plasma fire ripped through the night, cutting jagged lines of destruction through the battered streets. The Empire had responded to their defiance with overwhelming force, pressing down with the weight of its war machine. Towering mechs, bristling with energy cannons, moved in coordinated lines, their shields flickering as they absorbed small arms fire. Aerial gunships prowled the skies, unleashing precision strikes that sent shockwaves through shattered buildings. The Americans were pinned, their initial momentum fading beneath the relentless Imperial counterattack. Captain Jack Reynolds crouched behind the remains of a collapsed wall, his rifle held tight against the shoulder. Sweat traced lines through the dust on his face as he watched the battlefield shift. The Empire was no longer underestimating them. They had committed an entire battalion to the fight, determined to crush the resistance before it could spread. It wasn't just about the city anymore. It was about making an example of them. Lieutenant Eric Vasquez slid into cover beside him, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. His eyes flicked toward the advancing mechs, reading their movements, analyzing their patterns. "We can't hold this position much longer. They're cutting off every escape route." Reynolds nodded. The Empire wasn't just attacking. They were forcing the Americans into a kill box. With every step back, the noose tightened. If they didn't act fast, they'd be wiped out before reinforcements ever arrived. Sergeant Marcus Mac Holloway ducked in from the side, his breathing heavy from a sprint through enemy fire. He dropped a scavenged Imperial rifle onto the ground, its sleek, alien design a stark contrast to the battered American gear. "Shields are the problem," he said. "Standard rounds don't do a damn thing against them. Even explosives only shake them up for a second." Vasquez picked up the rifle, inspecting its power cell. "These things are tuned for energy-based combat. They're not built to handle kinetic impact." He looked up, his mind already working through the implications. "We need something that hits harder. A lot harder." Reynolds exhaled, considering their options. They were running low on heavy munitions, and every second wasted meant more Imperial boots on the ground. He turned to Mac. "What do we have left?" Mac rifled through his pack, pulling out a schematic downloaded from a fallen Imperial officer's datapad. "Their armor's got weak points, but we need something that can punch through before the shields can compensate. I can modify our rounds, tweak the payloads, make them hit like a freight train." He gestured toward the remains of an enemy outpost they had taken earlier. "We salvaged some of their munitions. If we mix their high-energy cores with our explosive shells, we might be able to overload their shields long enough for a kill shot." Reynolds didn't hesitate. "Do it." Mac and his engineers worked fast, stripping enemy power cores, rigging improvised warheads, recalibrating their weapons on the fly. Every spare moment counted. Vasquez scouted ahead, marking enemy patrols, calculating the best locations for traps. The Mechs were their biggest threat, and he had no intention of facing them head-on. Instead, he set charges along the path of their advance, waiting for the perfect moment to turn the battlefield against them. As the Imperials tightened the net, the Americans made their move. When the first mech crossed into the kill zone, Vasquez triggered the detonators. The ground erupted, a chain of explosions tearing through the street, throwing debris and dust high into the air. The towering machine staggered, its shields flickering as it struggled to compensate. Before it could recover, Mac's modified rounds tore through the weakened barrier, punching deep into its chassis. The mech lurched, sparks and fire erupting from its joints, before it collapsed in a heap of twisted metal. The Empire hesitated. Their war machines were supposed to be unstoppable, their shields impervious to human weapons. But in seconds, one of their best had been reduced to scrap. The Americans pressed the advantage, using their modified munitions to tear through enemy lines. Grenades overloaded energy fields, sniper rounds found exposed circuitry, and every carefully planned ambush sent another squad of Imperials to the dirt. Reynolds led the charge, moving with calculated aggression. The city belonged to neither side now. It was a battlefield shaped by strategy, by adaptability, by the raw will to survive. The Empire had the numbers, the technology, the overwhelming force. But the Americans had something else. They had ingenuity. They had unpredictability. They had an unwillingness to break, even in the face of annihilation. Still, the fight was far from over. As the last mech fell, a new threat emerged. Imperial warships loomed overhead, their cannons adjusting, preparing to level entire districts. The Empire had recognized the resistance for what it was, not an inconvenience, but a genuine threat. They weren't going to waste more ground troops. They were going to erase the battlefield entirely. Vasquez wiped the sweat from his brow, his breath coming fast. They're not playing around anymore. Reynolds stared up at the ships, his jaw tight. The Empire had underestimated them before. Now they were overcompensating. Mac shook his head, a grin creeping across his face. They think bigger means better. They think dropping fire from the sky is going to end this. He turned to Reynolds. We've been fighting like infantry. Maybe it's time we started fighting like artillery. Reynolds didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. Mac already had a plan forming, and right now, plans were the only thing keeping them alive. They had held their ground. They had adapted. Now they needed to hit back. The ground trembled beneath the relentless barrage of Imperial artillery. Explosions rolled through the city, sending fire and steel screaming into the air. The Empire had abandoned precision. They weren't hunting the Americans anymore. They were trying to bury them. High above, warships adjusted their targeting systems, readying for orbital bombardment. If the battle continued at this pace, there wouldn't be a battlefield left to fight on. Captain Jack Reynolds moved through the ruins with practiced efficiency, his eyes locked on the shifting patterns of Imperial troop movements. The enemy had pulled back just enough to avoid their own fire, repositioning to encircle the remaining human forces. They weren't going to stop until there was nothing left but rubble and silence. The Americans needed to act now, or this war would end in a smoldering grave. Lieutenant Eric Vasquez crouched beside a half-destroyed transport, a scavenged Imperial datapad balanced on his knee. His fingers moved quickly, bypassing firewalls, overriding encrypted systems. The Empire's arrogance was its weakness. They never expected their technology to be turned against them. The screen flickered, displaying a full schematic of the Imperial assault. Every mech, every ship, every artillery position. More importantly, it showed a vulnerability. He exhaled, steadying himself. They're overloading their systems. The ships in low orbit are running power straight into the bombardment cannons. If we hit them while they're charging. Reynolds finished the thought. We take them out before they fire. Sergeant Marcus, Mac. Holloway grinned as he adjusted the wiring on a modified warhead. Gonna need something that punches higher than what we've been using. His fingers moved with the precision of a man who had built destruction into an art form. We rigged this right, and we turned that firepower back on them. Reynolds didn't need convincing. The plan was insane, but insanity had kept them alive this long. He looked at his men, bloodied, exhausted, but still standing. They weren't done yet. The first step was getting in position. The Americans moved through the wreckage of the city, staying ahead of enemy patrols, cutting down stragglers with swift efficiency. The Imperials fought with numbers, but numbers meant nothing when their squads were wiped out before they could call for reinforcements. They reached the target zone, an abandoned Imperial supply outpost that still had working launch systems. Mac's engineers got to work, stripping down scavenged munitions, repurposing fuel cells, amplifying warheads beyond safe limits. There was no room for error. Vasquez knelt beside him, checking the range calculations. If we fire from here, we've got a 5-second window before their automated defenses kick in. Mac smirked. Plenty of time. Reynolds checked his rifle one last time, then turned to his team. Once this launches, they'll know exactly where we are. No one hesitated. The missile screamed into the sky, a streak of fire cutting through the night. Imperial sensors registered the launch immediately. Alarms blared across enemy comms. Plasma turrets pivoted, tracking the trajectory, but it was too late. The warhead detonated high above the city, sending an electromagnetic shockwave across the battlefield. The orbiting warship, still locked into its energy transfer cycle, absorbed the full force of the blast. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sky ignited. The Imperial warship convulsed as its overloaded systems collapsed in on themselves. Secondary explosions rippled through its hull. A chain reaction tore through its core, and then the entire vessel came apart, its remains streaking down in burning fragments. The battlefield shifted in an instant. The Empire had counted on orbital support to finish the fight. Without it, their forces hesitated. The Americans didn't. Reynolds led the final charge, his rifle kicking against his shoulder as he advanced. They had fought too hard, adapted too much to let this moment slip. Every bullet found its mark. Every grenade sent enemy lines scattering. The Imperials, once so confident, now scrambled to regroup. It was too late. The tide had turned. The Americans weren't just surviving anymore. They were winning. Flaming wreckage rained down from the sky, the remnants of the destroyed Imperial warship crashing into the battlefield in molten chunks. The once unstoppable advance of the Galactic Empire had ground to a halt, hesitation creeping into their ranks. Without the promised orbital support, their forces were exposed, vulnerable in a way they had never considered possible. The Americans had turned the fight against them, and now the final blow was within reach. Captain Jack Reynolds pushed forward, his rifle sweeping across the ruins as he led his team through the chaos. The enemy still outnumbered them, but numbers meant nothing if morale had been shattered. The disciplined formations of the Imperial troops had frayed, their cohesion breaking under the weight of an opponent that refused to die. The battlefield had become a war zone of broken lines and desperate movements, and the Americans thrived in that kind of fight. Lieutenant Eric Vasquez kept to Reynolds' right, his sharp eyes catching the smallest shifts in enemy positioning. Every move the Empire made betrayed its desperation. They had stopped pressing forward with confidence. Now, they fought just to hold their ground. Vasquez marked key enemy officers in the dwindling command structure, calling out positions, directing fire. It wasn't about wiping them out. It was about breaking them completely. The moment they lost faith in their own victory, it was over. Sergeant Marcus Mac. Holloway knelt beside a downed Imperial walker, prying open a maintenance panel with quick, precise movements. Scattered across the battlefield were pieces of the Empire's own war machine, and Mac wasn't about to let that go to waste. With a practiced hand, He rewired a still-functional targeting system, rerouting its guidance to lock onto enemy positions. Within seconds, the disabled walker's own automated turrets reactivated. Only now, they fired on Imperial soldiers. The moment the first shot struck, confusion spread like wildfire. The enemy's lines buckled under the unexpected assault. What was once an organized retreat became a full collapse. Soldiers scrambling for cover, abandoning posts, turning on each other in panicked miscommunication. Reynolds seized the moment, pressing the attack with ruthless precision. His men moved like ghosts through the shattered landscape, cutting down resistance with swift, calculated efficiency. A distant roar signaled the arrival of more Imperial reinforcements, fresh troops deployed from the remaining warships, desperate to stabilize the crumbling front. The Empire had underestimated the Americans once. Now they were overcorrecting, throwing everything they had into a last, decisive stand. Heavy mechs dropped from low-altitude carriers, their massive frames shaking the ground upon landing. Infantry poured in behind them, their numbers vast, their weapons glowing with lethal energy. Reynolds watched them come, his expression unreadable. The Empire was still playing by its own rules, believing brute force would tip the scales back in their favor. But this war had never been about numbers. It had been about adaptation, and the Americans had already figured out how to win. Mac had been waiting for this. The moment the reinforcements hit the ground, he gave the signal. Across the battlefield, hidden launchers, painstakingly assembled from salvaged enemy technology, fired in unison. Multi-rocket barges screamed through the air, their payload streaking toward the densest enemy positions. The mechs, built to withstand conventional fire, were not designed for this. The rockets didn't just explode. They tore through armor with armor-piercing warheads, detonated in secondary waves, overloaded shields and cascading failures. The ground quaked with the force of the bombardment. Within seconds, the Empire's final push had turned into a death trap. The once unstoppable advance became a slaughter. The towering mechs collapsed under relentless fire, their pilots ejected only to be cut down before they could regroup. The infantry that had marched so confidently into battle now found themselves in a killing field, the air thick with smoke and fire. The battlefield transformed into a vision of pure devastation. Vasquez moved through the wreckage, finishing off what remained of enemy command. Those who surrendered were stripped of weapons and left where they stood. No time for prisoners, not yet. The ones who ran were given no quarter. The Empire had not come here for negotiation. Neither had they. Reynolds surveyed the ruins of the battlefield, his rifle lowering slightly as he took in the aftermath. What had once been a city overrun by Imperial might was now a graveyard of their arrogance. The Galactic Empire had called them cowards. They had believed humanity to be weak, too fragile to stand against them. And now, their most advanced war machines lay in burning wreckage, their elite forces wiped out, their ships retreating from a planet they had once thought already conquered. Mac exhaled, wiping sweat and soot from his face. Guess that settles that. Vasquez kicked over an enemy rifle, watching as its power core flickered and died. They'll be back. Reynolds nodded. Yeah, but next time, they won't be so eager. Above them, the remaining Imperial warships broke formation, retreating into the upper atmosphere. The battle was won. But the war had only just begun.